anyone and everyone. Welcome to Have You Heard About This Case? My name is Sam.
And my name is Kelly. Let's jump right in. So, far from growing in his relationship with John Allan, Edgar Allan Poe's foster father, the rift is continuing. In fact, as we left Edgar in part one, it's said going forward here his foster father has even less fondness for the boy, often complaining about him. In letters, he described Edgar to Henry Poe, the boy's brother, as a miserable, sulky, and ill-tempered to all the family, end quote. He finishes his letter to the boy's brother with, quote, "The boy possesses not a spark of affection for us, not a particle of gratitude for all my care and kindness toward him. I have given him a much superior education than I ever received myself," end quote.
All right. I just want to give a little bit of a recap here, just to make sure I know exactly where we left off from last week.
Sure.
Edgar's in school now.
Yes.
Or had just finished school, and John Allan is essentially kind of taking credit for his success by saying, I paid for his school.
Correct.
Right? Okay. I just wanted to make sure I remembered that right where we're jumping in.
We're back from London. We screwed up in London. His business failed there.
Oh, that's right. He had a business and he had to come back afterwards.
And so Edgar, I mentioned it just a tiny bit. Edgar got educated for a bit in London. So a little bit of...
And he went to that special private school.
Yeah.
And then he's back in the States.
Yeah, I said that in part one, I think, that he came back feeling kind of a little superior to the other boys. Because Yeah. Edgar is still in school, though he's about to finish school. And John Allan has thoughts about that as well.
All right.
Yeah. And so after the letter to his brother, with all of them quotes, I left out a couple quotes too that were even more unflattering. But one family friend who was so close to Allan, he had provided housing for the family before, said that Allan never let Edgar forget his, quote, dependence on charity. However, it's said in the same time frame that the bile rose ever higher between Allan and Edgar. His genuine devotion to his foster mother, Fanny Allan, greatly increased.
Well, she really cared for him, right?
Yes.
But she was sick.
Yes, she was sick.
That's right.
That's the prevailing... Unfortunately, the prevailing theme is that people who care for Edgar are often very ill, often with diseases from the Victorian era that are fatal without the medicine we have. And Fanny was one of them. She was the one who developed, they said, genuine fondness for Edgar. And Allan never did.
Crazy to think about with the fact that Allan was also an orphan and he was adopted and taken in. That's something that stuck with me so much with the last episode, because it's you'd think he would have some additional compassion because you can relate when so many other people just can't.
You would think, right? You would think that after everything he had seen as an orphan and being taken in, he might be more magnanimous, but it gets worse.
Wow.
So, yeah, all had not been well for the Allan family. As we recall in part one, their London company failed, and the debt accrued by this was so large that Allan had to reach out to his fabulously rich uncle, William Galt. And Galt even continued to provide when he passed away, leaving Allan an immense fortune.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, tons of money.
So that doesn't seem like it's going to be good based on what we know about Allan's personality.
Yeah, and his relationship to Edgar. And the windfall is so great, it resulted in the family purchasing a home. This home has a name, Moldavia. 3 months later, And at the time, this home is considered a mansion.
Oh, wow.
So, like, the money that Galt left was considerable. And we also know from part one, we talked a lot about class and stuff like that. And I imagine that the move to Moldavia may have done good things for Edgar's self-esteem.
Yeah, because he was kind of like in that in-between class,
Yes.
where he was kind of invited up, but
Yes.
kind of not given the privileges of being in that class in reality.
Yeah, he was thought less of, especially since Alan had not formally adopted him.
Oh, that's right. He didn't formally adopt him as well.
He did not. Let's refresh. Yeah, let's just hit that super hard because we're about to hear some stuff about Alan that is important to that. Alan did not formally adopt Poe. He just took him into his home. That's why Poe often eliminated Alan from his name. Alan also, very specifically, it was said, did not include Edgar as an heir to him.
Oh, interesting.
He was not, yeah. So he was not adopted and he was not an heir to any of this, because we're seeing now money. We're seeing money coming in now.
Right.
And Edgar is not named as heir at all. So that kind of foreshadows for you a little bit how this is going to go. But at the same time, it seems Alan thinks fully supporting Edgar's education is over now that Edgar reaches the University of Virginia. So he's starting college. And when he arrives with the money Alan had given him, he lacked the right amount to pay for his school fees and his living expenses.
Oh, wow. And,
So,
like,
yeah,
it amazes me.
just the most basic things to go to school.
Especially when you're wealthy at this point.
Yeah, and hold on, I have amounts for you right here. You're very wealthy enough to have a mansion. We have it in a letter that Poe said to Alan, quote, "I will boldly say that it is wholly and entirely your own mistaken parsimony that caused all the difficulties in which I was involved in Charlottesville. The expenses of the institution at the lowest estimate were $350 per annum. You sent me there with $110, end quote.
Not even half. Not even a third.
Not even half. Yeah. We've already talked off air this episode. I'm going to end up cutting a lot of chatter out of it, and pauses from me probably that'll make this shorter. But little tidbits for you, just so you know too, and so someone else knows. But yeah, $350 per annum. You sent me there with $110. And he's at the University of Virginia. These students they're wealthy.
Well, a lot of times when you're at college at that point, just in general, you're pretty wealthy.
Right, especially considering the time period.
Mm-hmm.
You're probably very wealthy. So not only does Edgar not have the money to pay for the most basic things to do with the university, we can most likely say that he definitely doesn't have anything to spare to keep up, so to speak, with the Victorian Joneses.
Yeah, just keep up with his peers.
Yeah, no. He doesn't have any. He's $110. And all these calamitous beginnings actually contradict his schoolwork. Unfortunately, Poe was only able to remain at the university for 9 months due to Alan's refusal to continue to, quote, subsidize a university education, end quote. So, he was a good student, and he's embedded in all of these areas of language, taking all these classes. And a Professor McGann added that one of them was with George Wilhelm Blatterman, and he was a German scholar introduced to Poe in school, and he is introducing him to the most advanced theoretical school of German Romanticism at the time. It had a profound influence on the poetry as well as the fiction, end quote. So we can conclude that while Poe was not able to complete his degree, he received new ideas from the teachings while he was there.
Well, he was always a good student, and it's clearly just with him being upset over not being funded to go by his wealthy foster father.
Very
that
wealthy.
he values school and he wants to continue.
Right. And like when I said immersed in languages, he was taking like 5 languages.
Wow, I wish I had that talent. I know I've said that before on here, but I wish I did.
But he can only stay there for 9 months because that's what he has.
Yeah.
And when he returns home after his stint at this degree, it goes from bad to worse. And it ended in December, the school year. Poe is expected to return home to work at one of Allen's businesses for free. This is when Allen and Poe finally reach their breaking point as family members. In March, Poe had either determined to leave the mansion or Allen was throwing him out. This isn't made clear, and I would love to know.
So I could see that going either way pretty easily.
Me too. I mean, that's a toss-up right there. And however, Poe made no secrets of his feelings. He got hot, saying to his former foster father, quote, "My determination is at length taken to leave your house and endeavor to find some place in this wide world where I will be treated not as you have treated me," end quote.
Good for him.
Yeah, call it like it is, because more importantly, I think his second quote here is, quote, "Again, I have heard you say, when you little thought I was listening, and therefore must have said it in earnest, that you had no affection for me," end quote.
He heard it, I'm sure, as he said, but he also probably just felt it.
Yeah, we talked a lot
he knows
in part
it.
1. Yeah, we talked a lot in part 1 about how Edgar almost certainly knew and felt that Allen was not able to. He saw himself, we said it a couple times, as a benefactor, not as a parent.
Yeah. But he's not even being a benefactor.
Not anymore.
He's not supporting him. He's not giving him the finances as a benefactor would.
No, not even half of them. Not even half of finances. So, Edgar leaves. I mean, good for him. It's March 1827, and he goes to Boston. As he arrives, and he picks up some work, but he mainly sought to have his first book, Tamerlane and Other Poems, published. And he was just 18 now. However, this also meant in late May, prior to the publication of the work, he signed up for a 5-year hitch with the Army, enlisting under yet another pseudonym, Edgar A. Perry. Such began a relatively short, unhappy stint in the Army for Poe. I won't be getting into it much here, but there's plenty I'm leaving out, if you're curious. It consisted mainly of Edgar reaching out to Allen to get him out of the military, and Allen refusing to do that. In fact, despite the multiple letters sent to him, it seemed Allen had finished with Edgar and did not even answer the letters.
I feel like Edgar really had to be that unhappy in the military to have to reach out to Allen. Like, I feel like that would be like a last-ditch effort.
At last ditch, after bouncing out of their mansion as fast as you can and getting to, Boston, it must have been really bad for him to be. And I know for a fact from the book, I highly recommend you guys. This episode is already going to be so long. There was much I had to cut because the book is very well written and very detailed, but this cannot go on for 8 hours. So I know for a fact that there were multiple letters that he did not answer. And I know that the tone of the letters, from Edgar's tone, at least, improved as they arrived. He would slowly start to take a little more responsibility for things, and Alan was totally unmoved by any of it. He didn't answer any of it.
Yeah, he's checked out.
No, he's gone. He's totally doesn't care. And unfortunately, only one thing can get these letters answered. And typically for Poe, it's a tragedy. And that is Fanny Allen, Poe's beloved foster mother, died of tuberculosis on February 28th at 44.
No, she's young.
And then this part is so sad. And I've already said I hate this guy about Alan a lot, but here we go again. Poe had repeatedly asked Alan for word of Ma and her condition in his letters. But due to the lack of response, he was seemingly unaware that the illness had turned so dire. And tragically, in the end, it was said Fanny begged to see Edgar. Only the leave from the military was granted at such a time that even though he raced to Richmond, he arrived the night after Fanny's funeral.
Oh, that's sad. Because travel takes so long at that point, too.
So long.
That, like,
yeah,
earlier communication would have made a huge difference.
A huge difference. If all you had answered the letter with was, your ma is extremely ill, then you could have immediately started to think about travel. Not like, she's dying, better tell him. And he doesn't even get to be there. You know, like, it's just another mother figure in his life that has been just taken from him. And Alan's not done yet, because the book describes it as a thunderclap that would have, quote, shaken the ground under Poe, when in early October, Alan remarried at 51 to a 20 years younger Louisa Gabriella Patterson, who is from a wealthy family. So now not only is Alan immensely wealthy through his inheritance, he's married to somebody very wealthy.
Right, so yeah, that money's not going anywhere.
No. And Louisa would go on to have 3 of Alan's children. And even before meeting them, Poe was said to know his standing had changed dramatically. Because, you know, now we have more biological children of Alan involved.
Right.
And Edgar is not named anywhere. Then after gossip, even in the olden days, through letters, after some gossip reached him that was started by Edgar in an effort to leave the military, Alan heard about it and said that he never wanted to hear from Poe again.
After Fanny's death, I wouldn't expect either of them to have a relationship at all.
You make a very good point.
Like, Fanny was the only person holding them together in any way, I'm sure.
Yeah. And the poor woman was probably barely able to do it. She was really ill. She's not getting the letters, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Ugh. So he never wants to hear from Poe again. So Poe departs for New York on February 19th. Then, almost immediately on arriving in New York, Poe fell ill, and symptoms included a violent cold, headaches, and a discharge of blood from the ear.
Oh, that's probably not good.
No.
I don't know what that would be, but that I can't imagine is good.
No, yeah, because though he was set to make a recovery and publish his 3rd volume of poems, I think we can all agree that this symptom seems pretty troubling.
Yeah.
We're bleeding from the ear. In fact, the ever-present specter over his life would hit him again. Poe's brother Henry succumbed to advanced tuberculosis and heavy drinking on August 31st, 1831, at just 24.
Oh, wow. And he was placed in a different household, right?
Correct.
Okay, so Poe was placed alone in his household.
Yes, there were 3 Poe children, and when they were orphaned, they were separated. Each to a different home, yes. But they still kept in contact with each other.
Good, because can't imagine that's the easiest thing to do.
We should establish... we should establish, though, that Henry was the one who was taken by Edgar's grandparents.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that.
So that might be because we have very little more information about Rosalie, who, if you remember, she was only 1 when she was adopted. So a lot less there. But he's still communicating with Henry, and unfortunately, Henry dies at just 24.
So young.
And Poe is said to have been really upset by this, felt it keenly, because it's the same type of condition and symptoms said to have caused their father's death when his father was 27. But so his brother's even younger.
Right.
24.
So young.
It's insane. So after a little time in New York, Poe, again, I mentioned in part 1 that he loves to move, but this is where the moving is, I mentioned frequently in the script where we are, just so you all know, because he's moving and shaking. And he goes that spring to Baltimore from New York at just 22. And at 22, little did the troubled writer know, he had lived more than half of his life and had written half of his poems. And financially, he had nothing to show for it.
Oh, yeah, that, especially like when you know how well known he becomes later.
Oh,
it's sad.
It's so sad. It's really sad. They're literally the next... Wait till you hear that last sentence in the next paragraph. It's all so sad. As Poe neared his 23rd birthday, he would become enchanted with the gothic fantasy elements that we know him so well for. It would also seem things were taking a good turn in Poe's domestic life. While he experienced only rejection and death in Richmond, according to Enrique Yang, executive director of Poe Baltimore, quote, he goes to Baltimore and finds the family that says, "You're one of us." He finds his chosen family here. This is the house where Poe sought refuge, end quote.
Good. I'm glad he was able to find something.
Exactly. Because he's also able to find his aunt, Maria Clem. And she proves to be the strong motherly figure that Poe has always desired. And she just proves to be that motherly figure that he needs. And Yang elaborates, Maria, quote, Maria, no stranger to poverty, welcomed him into her household. And he goes dark here and begins to write those short stories, end quote. Sadly, these Baltimore years are among the least documented of all Poe's life, so what day-to-day was like for him falls largely to speculation. Poor Edgar, the happiest period in his life, turns out to be the least preserved.
Right. Well, that, honestly, like, that's not a terrible thing. I know we talked a lot about parasocial relationships in the first.
Yeah.
And I am a very strong believer, and I said this in that episode as well, that like things should be kept private. Like, this is your life. It doesn't need to be every single second to be shared with everyone. And especially when it comes to like he's gone through all of these terrible things, I don't think it's a bad thing that the happiest period isn't well documented, because hopefully he was just living his life and enjoying it.
Hopefully, and judging by his literary output, he was. He produced an incredible amount of writing in this period of time. So he is sharing certain things with the public. It's just his...
It's by choice.
Writing. It's his writing, yeah. It's not his letters. So in May 1833, after sending his final letter to Allen ever documented, Poe sought a local outlet for his writing, and the Baltimore Saturday Visitor dropped into his lap. The next month, they were having a contest to encourage literature, offering $50 as a prize for the best story.
Which would be a lot of money at that point. That's a lot of money.
Yeah, a lot of money. And we've already mentioned a few times that Poe and his family are living in deep poverty.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a lot of money. And it's for writing, you know? And one of the judges, John H.B. Latrobe, recalls that the judges were, quote, wholly unprepared for what Poe sent in for the contest. The stories were, according to Latrobe, quote, so very far superior to anything before us that we had no difficulty in awarding the first prize to the author. Our only difficulty was in selecting from the rich contents of the volume, end quote.
That's an impressive, group of submissions from him then.
Yeah, because that's all of Baltimore.
Right? Yeah, exactly. That's a big deal to have that sort of comment come out of a contest.
Yeah. After the complete severance of their relationship, John Allan died on March 27th. He left an immense fortune in many holdings. Allan accounted for his widow and 3 children as the main beneficiaries, and even his illegitimate children were provided for with inheritances, except one. Poe was not mentioned in the will.
It's just so weird. I don't know. It's weird.
It's like he purposefully has decided, like, this kid, I do not like this kid.
Oh, he clearly has decided that, but I just don't understand why.
Yeah. So Poe took to this indignity, though probably not total shock, by providing his own history of the story. He claimed that Allan had remarried when he was about 65, and that any quarrel between them stemmed from the new Mrs. Allan. Of course, the truth of that story is that Allan was only 54 when he died.
What? That doesn't add up.
Yeah, he was 54 when he died.
Oh, but I also forgot that Poe liked to write his own narrative. I forgot about that. Yeah.
Yeah, this is his version. It's his own history. It's very embellished. And so the new Mrs. Allan, Louisa, she didn't like Poe or really have anything flattering to say, most likely speaking against him. There were no actual quarrels documented between the two.
Well, she's probably just hearing what Allan is saying, and that's it. She doesn't have the chance to get to know Edgar because Allan's keeping him away.
Yeah. And also, she's 3 children, you know? She's probably pretty busy making sure that they're taken care of and provided for. Meanwhile, her husband's foster son is rewriting history. The only factual statement from Poe in his account of what happened with Allan is that Allan, quote, bequeathed me nothing.
Right.
That's it. That's true. Though Poe had a flair for the dramatic and often mentioned his dire straits financially, it does seem at this time he was not exaggerating. In August 1834, he had been corresponding with Thomas Willis White, who was a Richmond printer that had founded the Southern Literary Messenger, and he suggested Poe for an editorial position.
Oh, nice.
And so Poe first appears in the magazine as a critic of a collection of poems. And then in late March, he began to publish stories in the style we all have come to expect of him. One of Poe's draws to the editors, though, was not these stories. It was that Poe accepted just $5 per published piece. So White offered him a permanent position, and Poe eagerly accepted this position, looking to settle there.
Was $5 not common? Was that low?
It was low, yeah.
So they're like, great, like, you're a good writer and you're cheap.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah. And we talked a tiny bit in part 1 about how the way Poe saw himself and how he attained fame and that sort of thing. And one of them that he probably wouldn't like too much is that he garnered a lot of fame as a critic. And that's what's happening here. He's being a critic. He's making money. It probably wouldn't make him too happy, but I mean, hey, it's making money.
Gotta make ends meet.
Right. So Poe's eagerly looking to settle there, and Richmond becomes almost but never quite as close as Poe gets to a hometown. And his title was to be staff writer, literary critic, and catch-all editorial assistant. So now we're in Richmond.
Yeah, so he just kind of went back.
Yeah, exactly. We ping-pong back and forth. Although things were still not financially well in Edgar's life and already vulnerable, he was said to be plunged into despair by a letter in late August from Maria Clem, who, if we remember, that is his aunt, who has become a mother figure to him.
Mm-hmm.
She was seeking advice as Nielsen Poe, Edgar's cousin, had offered to take Virginia into his home and see to her welfare and education.
And Virginia's the younger sister.
Virginia is Maria's daughter, Poe's cousin.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay, that makes more sense.
Yes. Don't worry, I'll tell you how old she is. I don't like it. Nielsen is offering to take her in and help provide for her. And however, for Poe, this would mean the loss of the home he had found and the aunt who had become a surrogate mother, as she would likely go with Virginia. And most importantly to Poe, it would mean the loss of Virginia. Poe more than deeply cared for her. He was in love with her. Remember in part 1 when I said Poe would marry several women, but in my opinion, he only loved one?
Mm-hmm.
Meet Virginia Clem. And like we just said, a lot of people know this story about Poe. Virginia was, yes, his cousin. Yeah. However, in this time and place in history, young brides and marriages between cousins were actually common.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't like it, but I know that was fairly normal.
No, I don't like it. But yeah, I guess it did happen all the time. What did raise eyebrows and cause some scandal and pause was Virginia's age in particular. She had just turned 13 when Poe declared his love for her.
Yeah, I don't like that either. But also, it happened a lot at that time.
Yeah, so we have some disturbance among the 1800s public even, and more than a little disturbance with this co-host. What is beyond doubt, though, is the sincerity and depth of his feelings for Virginia, and that she adored him as well. Writing Maria Clem on August 29th, Edgar proclaimed, quote, I love Virginia passionately, devotedly. I cannot express in words the fervent devotion I feel towards my dear little cousin, my own darling, end quote.
Yeah, I don't even like hearing that. Like, that's uncomfortable.
I wrote, gross, but at this point in our coverage, I really do want Edgar to be happy, question mark?
Right? But he's 23, right? So he's 10 years older than her. 13. Ugh. It's too young.
Young enough that even the 1800s public is like, that seems young.
Yeah, I don't like that. That makes me uncomfortable.
Yeah, oh no, I don't like it. And also, like, some of there was more in that letter that I cut out. I was like, ugh. So at the Messenger, White was becoming increasingly alarmed by the amount of Poe's drinking. It's not known. Poe may have been fired, or he might have quit on the point of being fired. The next certain thing that happens is that Poe immediately bolted for Baltimore, where his continued ardor and vulnerability won over Maria and Virginia Clem. So they're not going to go with Nielsen.
But wasn't the point of going to get Virginia education?
And yeah, but not just that, essentially to take her into his home and provide for her.
You would think that like Poe would value at least the education part of it.
You would think.
Yeah, I don't know. We're looking at it from current day point of view, and I just don't think we'll understand.
Yeah, no, I'm sure his cousin had every magnanimous idea at heart, but nope. So, a week after this, Poe wrote to White asking to be reinstated at the Messenger. White responded as affectionately and sympathetically as he could, while also putting his foot down. He told Poe the job was his under one condition, that he must give up drinking. White said, quote, "Tell me if you can, and will do so, and let me hear that it is your fixed purpose never to yield to temptation. If you should come to Richmond again, and again be an assistant in my office, it must be expressly understood by us that all engagements on my part would be dissolved the moment you get drunk." White closed with, "I am your true friend," end quote.
I think that's fair. Like, I know that, like, nowadays a job can't say, like, you have to quit. Right. There's obviously laws around that. It can't impede your job. If it's affecting your job, then you can absolutely be fired for it. But
yeah,
I think that's fair. Like, I think that's something that clearly was affecting his job to either get to the point of being fired or quitting on that verge.
Yeah, it was absolutely clearly affecting his jobs. We'll see. And the letter was longer from White, and he is even more like caring and puts his foot down, but he like puts it down even more, and he says like, "No man who drinks in the morning with breakfast can survive."
Yeah, that's fair.
Poe's drinking in the morning with breakfast. So, yikes. Okay. So, Poe agreed to White's understandable demand that he not be intoxicated at work, and he returned from Baltimore with Virginia and Maria on October 3rd. Maria said Poe was, quote, "indeed a son to me." Which is nice to hear,
and
because
you have a daughter that he's in love with.
Yes, and and it's nice to hear because he so far hasn't had that.
Yeah, no, it is very nice to have that mother figure. It's just that dynamic is odd.
Yeah, it's all very odd. Yeah. You should hear his nicknames for them. I eliminated the nicknames for them because I thought they were gross.
Ugh.
Yeah, I was like, ew. With this support system in place, Poe again turned to work at the Messenger with a renewed vigor. And on Monday, May 16th, 1836, Poe and Virginia were married by a Presbyterian minister in the presence of White and his daughter Eliza, Maria Clem, and others. Virginia was still just 13 years old. But Poe, sidestepping gossip and scandal, it would seem, gave her age as 21. Ooh.
Yeah, that doesn't, like, knowing that he writes his own narrative, he knows what people are saying, and he's just gonna like, I'm gonna write a new one.
Yeah, exactly. He's like, no, she's 21. I'm like, dude, I don't know, man. So in his new position at the Southern Literary Messenger, Poe's substantial contributions consisted of reviews, critiques, same thing as before, and he did all this not for its literary benefits or any passion, but to provide for his newlywed bride and his dependent surrogate mother. And by most accounts, the family were happy. Quote, he was unquestionably of an affectionate disposition, of which he gave the best kind of proof when he labored cheerfully for the maintenance of Virginia and Maria, wrote his friend Lambert Wilmer.
Well, it's good that he's finally, like, stable in his home. Emotionally, minimally. He's providing for it, but he's emotionally stable.
Yes, and he's creating that support system of people around him that he didn't have before. But by that fall, the Southern literary messenger was not holding the same sway over Poe, and his relationship with White was straining. The two men were headed for a break, although the main reason remains in doubt. It's been suggested by some that Poe was drinking again, although White never cited this as a reason for their parting of the ways, although it's possible. After this, Poe stayed in Richmond until late January and then moved again to New York. So I think it's fairly reasonable that it may have been the drink that dissolved it with White.
In all likelihood, I think so as well.
Because yes, as we heard from White's letter, he clearly had a degree of affection for Edgar, and from his previous condition, what would dissolve his employment was if he started drinking.
Mm-hmm. Well, and we just know that he had a lot of different issues along his life that involved drinking.
Mm-hmm.
Just following the trend that we have already seen so far.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. The cyclical nature of it. And it continues. Because his second stint in New York proved to be more of the same problem for Poe, which is that of extreme poverty. And the solution became for Virginia, Maria, and Poe to move to a smaller house in early September. And Poe, he doesn't know it, but he has a few prospects that are about to enter the literary stratosphere, producing the mature works that would make him a rock star to future generations. It would be his most productive and impressive stretch as a writer, and it began that October. Now, this we talked about, and we've gone over that beautiful and ethereal women rarely fare well in Poe's work. In fact, Poe scholar Petit said, quote, if you're a woman and Poe loves you, look out, you're doomed. End quote.
Yeah, well, let's say, yeah, that kind of fits with his work.
Yep, that's a short version, pretty much. Yep, that's what happens. And curator Sempner added, quote, he's looking at death in a different way and all kinds of ways. He's grappling with it. What is the transition between life and death? What happens to us? Those are his questions, but they're ours too. End quote. Just sort of an ethos for Poe. It's just that in his poems, he usually explores it through dead ladies.
Right.
So, Poe becomes assistant editor at the Burton's Gentleman's Magazine, which is harder to say than I thought it would be. He found the work to be largely the same as The Messenger, although he was promised differently by the editor. And attention turned to his friendships when he became acquainted with one of Philadelphia's leading writers, Thomas Dunn English. Novelist Matthew Pearl expanded that Poe, quote, had difficulty with friendships. He could push people away who were genuinely fond of him and wanted to help him. He could be charming, courtly, witty, and gracious, but he could also be sensitive, petty, suspicious, jealous, and resentful. He wanted to be noticed and appreciated, but he had a difficult time with processing appreciation. End quote.
That all makes sense, I feel like, with what we know about him and how he grew up.
Exactly.
Like, that all makes a lot of sense.
That's why I included it, because that quote, just the different adjectives describing each side of him, I'm like, that all tracks with exactly the childhood we saw.
Mm-hmm.
And it's another sad thing that he's has a habit of pushing these people away, because unfortunately him and Thomas Dunn English would be friends for a bit, but they would have a spectacular falling out due to critique from Poe.
I don't know.
Well, he was a literary critic, but apparently it was like off the clock critiqued Thomas Dunn English, and he didn't like that. But around the Halloween of 1839, Poe published the horror story The Fall of the House of Usher.
See, I've heard of that one, but I've never read it. No, I don't know what it's about or anything. Just heard of it.
You should. It's a great one. You should wait for Halloween until it's nice and spooky. Halloween 1839 is the perfect time for this one to be published, because it's just it's a spooky short story and very popular.
I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, so he is still producing work. He's just foundering a bit in the personal realm. And on the topic of the fall of the House of Usher, Poe scholar Jeffrey A. Savoy said, quote, "Yes, he was writing for an audience and for a living, but Poe gives modern horror a kind of historical literary pedigree, which it really doesn't have without him," end quote. What concerns many Poe scholars isn't Poe's association with the horror genre, but the mischaracterization of his genius we discussed in part 1. Because that continues with the fall of the House of Usher, which is confusing Poe's own personality with that of his narrators.
Yeah, I actually had a bit of a conversation with my grandma about this the other day. And I was just telling her about the show and just a few things that we've been covering recently. And I mentioned that we're in the middle of Edgar Allan Poe right now. And her first thing, it was like he was a sad person. Mm-hmm. Like, that's the first thing. Like, he was dark and he was sad.
Yeah.
And so then I started to, like, elaborate a little bit more of, like, he had these whole different parts of his personality, and she had no idea.
Oh, yeah. He's very multifaceted. And unfortunately, I highly encourage you guys to listen to part 1 as well, because this is part 2, so we are edging closer to a lot of really sad stuff. And you've already heard a lot of really sad stuff. But it is true that Edgar Poe was, for the first part of his life, athletic, strong of health and character, and happy, was often seen puttering in his garden and liked cats. He wasn't at all like his narrators. But this episode, it brings him a lot closer to them. So I highly encourage you to listen to part 1 too, to fully appreciate that at one point he wasn't always this morose. It's just we're hearing a lot of stuff this episode that would make, I think, anybody a little morose.
Right.
Because so far we have lost Alan, which, I mean, probably not a lot of love lost there, but we lost a lot of money with that too. And then we lost his brother of tuberculosis, very young, 24. Same symptoms that killed his dad, tuberculosis, 27. And it's not going to get better. So I think it would make anybody a little morose.
Yeah, definitely.
And so by this time, the Poes had moved again to Philadelphia. And the move north being largely because it held a lot of power in magazine publishing, and Poe saw himself making his own monthly journal. And Petty, one of the Poe scholars, he makes the point, quote, I think if he stays in New York, he doesn't write stories like The Telltale Heart and The Black Cat. I don't think they happen. Philadelphia becomes the crucible for Poe's imaginative genius, end quote.
I know that he's associated with Philadelphia a lot.
Yes.
Yeah.
Correct. And yes, there are a few cool and exciting things about to happen here, too, to hopefully take the edge off some of what we've heard. Because the Philadelphia banks crashed in a financial crisis once Poe gets there and his ideas of a magazine are dashed. But instead, he accepts a generous offer from George Rex Graham to become the book review editor at Graham's magazine.
Oh, nice.
So he's going to stay in Philadelphia in this crucible where he does do a lot of really cool stuff, including this next paragraph, which I think is phenomenal. Because in this crucible of his genius, Poe is widely credited for making the first detective novels, starring his character C. Auguste Dupin.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know he did, like, detective novels.
He did. He was one of the first. Yeah, Dupin is, like, one of the first. He's, like, an everyman character who solves these crimes. He's kind of that first in that literary trope.
Oh, that's cool.
And when Arthur Conan Doyle met with reporters in New York in an 1894 visit to America, he was asked by a journalist, "Now, weren't you influenced by Edgar Allan Poe when you wrote Sherlock Holmes?" And a hush was said to have fallen over the room, members of the press expecting Doyle to have an outburst and be indignant. Instead, he eagerly acknowledged his debt to Poe by saying, quote, "Oh, immensely. His detective is the best detective in fiction. It was Poe who taught the possibility of making a detective story a work of literature," end quote.
Oh, that's awesome. I'll have to definitely check that out.
Yeah. So there would be no Sherlock Holmes without C. Auguste Dupin. Daniel Stashower, an author on Poe, says, quote, "Yes, you can say in the simplest terms that Poe invented the detective story with Murders in the Rue Morgue." That's the piece we're discussing as, the first. But he's very quickly pushing on and testing the limits to see what could be done. He's not repeating himself. And maybe I'll have time to include this, maybe I'll edit it out. But the sequel to Murders of the Rue Morgue was a true crime novel.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it was one of the first. It was about the murder of a cigar shop employee in New York City.
Oh, that's cool.
In fact, a voice that many of us who love true crime will recognize joins us now. One former FBI agent, John Douglas, co-author of Mindhunter, inside the FBI's elite serial crime unit, who argued that Poe did more than just invent a detective or a mystery story. Quote, "Like the men and women in my investigative support unit 150 years later, Poe understood the value of profiling when forensic evidence isn't enough to solve a particularly brutal and seemingly motiveless crime. Deprived of ordinary resources," he wrote, "the analyst throws himself into the spirit of his opponent, identifies himself therewith, and not infrequently sees thus at a glance the sole methods by which he may seduce into error or hurry into miscalculation." Douglas went on in his praise saying, quote, "This is as good a definition as I've seen of behavioral profiling and proactive criminal strategy. I firmly believe that without the pioneering work of such inspired storytellers as Poe, there is a good chance that modern criminal profiling as we know it would not exist," end quote.
Well, that's why his stories are good and interesting, and you can kind of relate that to us doing a podcast, and this is a form of entertainment. And why are we entertained by crime? It's not the crime itself, it's the understanding of why people do what they do more than anything else. And that's what made it interesting for literature.
And I just find it amazing that Douglas is finding, this common ground with modern day criminal profiling not existing as we know it without Edgar Allan Poe.
You needed somebody to kind of put that general idea, whether he knows he was doing it or not, into people's heads to continue to grow and become what it is today.
Yeah, I think he probably just had an immense imagination and creativity, like we know that. And he was exploring new genres and things like that. I don't know if he ever could have predicted that it would evolve into something as amazing as the co-author of Mindhunter and former FBI agent saying that he helped establish criminal profiling.
Right. And in reality, there's probably a lot of people who had very similar thoughts to Edgar.
Yeah.
But he had that talent to be able to put those thoughts into words on a paper and have it be in some way, shape, or form relatable to other people, which is why they're interested in it.
Yes, exactly. He was able to translate that to the public. So following all this laudatory praise from a huge name in true crime, which unfortunately he wouldn't hear because Poe dies. Poe is about to encounter one of the most profound sadnesses of his life. Philadelphia symbolized literary triumph, but also his greatest tragedy. On January 20th, 1842, while at home singing, 19-year-old Virginia suffered a pulmonary hemorrhage and began coughing up blood.
Oh, no.
Poe had only just turned 33 the day before. And he knew with dread that this was the first symptom of tuberculosis.
Yeah, he's been through it before.
Yep. This is his mother, his father, his brother. He knows. And he said, Poe recalled, quote, "Her life was despaired of. I took leave of her forever and underwent all the agonies of her death. She recovered partially, and I again hoped," end quote. However, there would be another hemorrhage before the year was out.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so she's rapidly declining. And her condition fluctuated until June, when there was a third hemorrhage. And this one was bad. It would cause her to be an invalid for much of the 5 years that she had left to live.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Another wonderful woman in Poe's life who he loved, who is now so ill that she's unable to leave her bed. And Poe was said to be filled with despair that Virginia may be dying, so much so he couldn't hear it from anybody else. A neighbor recalled that, quote, "the mention of it drove him wild," end quote.
Well, yeah, I can understand being in like a denial about it because you just don't want to go through it again.
It's probably a terrible denial, too, because you kind of know what's happening here.
Right.
Like, you kind of know, but when somebody says it to you, you're like, don't say that, I don't want it to be true. Like,
exactly.
I feel it, but I don't want it. And I think that's where it is, because the continued illness of Virginia drove Poe again to drink. And this is when he goes missing for several days in late June.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Showing up drunk in New Jersey at the house of a former girlfriend.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. Completely unexplained, too, by the way. Just no.
Oh, really?
There's, yeah. I wish I had more context for what happened here. But it is a trend. This happens again. He will go missing for days at a time now. And typically, once they recover him, he is drunk. In this case, in a different state. And it was in 1841 that another literary friend and magazine owner published The Telltale Heart in December. So he still has friends even though he's pushing people away, because another friend who was desperate to help Poe with his circumstances got him a job at a custom house in Washington. Though Poe would again mess this up by drinking on his arrival, and the job was called off.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
Before you even get started.
Yeah, they basically were like, well, you showed up drunk, so you're out. And so what I said was, we're starting to see that Virginia's death, or dying, is leading to Poe's own. He's starting arguments, insisting on wearing his coat inside out, and he's starting to lose his ability to garner favors from anyone because he's making enemies.
Yeah, it's like you want to support him, but you also don't want to deal with him when he's treating the people around him like that.
Right, or drunk. Yeah. And as this downturn is happening in his personal life, professionally, he's about to turn a corner. When he arrived back in Philadelphia, because we went to Washington, but we got drunk there, and so sent home back to Philadelphia. So his story, The Golden Bug, which is another famous one by him, it won a short story contest that had a prize attached to it. And he began giving very popular lectures where he was billed as the author of The Golden Bug, and they were considered a huge success. And not only did this lecture sell out, but there were hundreds more people who were waiting to have heard it.
Oh.
Yeah, so he has this strange dichotomy of things going horribly in his personal life, and then something really good happening professionally, and back and forth and back and forth.
Right. It seems like there's just not a balance at the same time between the two.
No. It seems like poor Poe can never get that balance. And then Poe would again move, sending for Virginia and Maria. And New York would be the home for the turbulent last 5 years of his life. So, we've settled down with the moving. It was here that Poe set to work revising and finishing a poem started in Philadelphia, The Raven. My favorite scene, if you will, of this story is that in January he had a conversation with friend William Ross Wallace on the street of New York. He told him, quote, "Wallace, I have just written the greatest poem that ever was written." "Have you?" he replied. "That's a fine achievement." After asking if he'd like to hear it, Poe delivered it, giving it the dramatic flair it wanted, and when finished, Wallace judged it as fine, uncommonly fine. And Poe immediately fired back, "Fine? Is that all you can say for this poem? I tell you, it's the greatest poem that was ever written." End quote.
Oh, that's funny, because, like, he knew. He knew what it was.
He knew. The Raven was first published in February 1845, the month after the conversation. And The Raven was more than a hit. It was Billboard 100 before it even existed. It was consistently republished all over the country, and Poe had finally achieved a level of fame that he must have found beyond gratifying.
Yeah, that's what he worked so hard for.
Exactly. Because this led to, I didn't mention this in the script, and we'll see if I cut it or not. But he also took to giving a series of lectures on the Raven as well, where he read the poem, and he would dim the lights in the theater during the lecture, which is not common at the time. But he wanted the story to, have ambiance.
That'd be something to see.
Yeah, he would read the Raven and, dim the lecture halls to, packed houses. So he's finally kind of getting some due. But, again, just as Poe has often been his own worst enemy, he was about to undo his new status with a combination of ill-advised literary feuds, poor judgment, some scandal, and drink. He turned to accusing several friends and well-loved authors, such as Longfellow and Lowell, as plagiarizing.
Oh, that's a big accusation.
Yeah. Big. And I could expand more there. But it was very one-sided. But I think it, again, shows that he is sort of starting to tip.
Right.
Here. He's tipping to, I don't want to say, some form of delusion or something like that, but he's clearly starting to show some symptoms, habits, things that don't seem ordinary.
Well, he's transitioned from making up and rewriting his own narrative to rewriting other people's narratives.
Yes. Correct.
That's a pretty big jump, especially when it's your peers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Especially when you think he tried to rewrite the story with Ellen, too.
Yeah, but that's still kind of his own story. He's still directly involved in that. He's not involved in accusing other people of plagiarizing.
No. Yeah, he's not involved with Longfellow or Lowell, but those were the two. He was not involved with, friends with, at all. Those two. And he accused both of them of plagiarism. And, yikes. Again, we're in the 1800s, so a lot of stuff is fighting words that isn't today. But even today, I think plagiarizing is a pretty big charge.
Oh yeah, and nowadays it's easier to prove whether you're plagiarizing or not with the internet and just algorithms and stuff. But back then, that would have been a big deal because your career is on that, and it's all rumor based because all you can really do is deny it until it's proven true. If you're innocent, all you can do is deny.
There's a huge passage with Poe flirting and the women he goes into, and a lot of these potential wives, things like that I've cut for time here. I highly suggest the book if you're more interested, because he makes a few missteps socially with some of these women. And though he flirted, his main devotion remained Virginia, who was rapidly worsening. And there was a move further out of town, so they're still in New York, but they're moving to a further borough, and it's hopefully to help with her health and with Poe's battered psyche. Health reformer Mary Gove visited the family that summer, and she said, quote, of Virginia, quote, "One felt she was almost a dissolved spirit, and when she coughed, it was made certain she was rapidly passing away," end quote.
Oh. Yeah, so it's when you're sitting there with her, you just could see how quickly it's happening.
You can tell, yes, it's happening. Yeah. Virginia was gradually wasting away, driving her husband deeper into depression. Poe wasn't lecturing. doing much writing of any kind. He had no steady employment, and he took to making enemies again, continuing to damage his reputation. In a brief moment of pulling creative brilliance out again, he published The Cask of Amontillado in November 1846. So his demise is nearing, but he wasn't done yet, because that's another great Poe story. It's another short story, another short horror story. A nurse, Marie Louise Shue, came to aid Virginia in the last months of her life. She said, quote, "The autumn came and Mrs. Poe sank rapidly in consumption," end quote. Virginia called Louise Shue to her bedside, took a picture of her husband from under her pillow, kissed it, and gave it to the nurse. She then, according to Shue, called Poe to her bedside, where she had preserved a letter from Louisa Allen, John Allen's second wife, where Louisa had taken responsibility for the break between the men.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Virginia wanted it always protected to verify proof of her husband's conduct. So she loved him so much.
Right.
It was January 30th when Virginia Poe passed away from tuberculosis at 24.
Oh, getting so young.
The same age and ailment that had taken Poe's mother.
And brother, 24 as well.
Yep, same. Poe commented much, but I think one of his most poignant things was, he said, quote, "In the death of what was my life then, I receive anew, but, oh God, how melancholy an existence," end quote.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a good way to put it after a death of a loved one, where it's like, things are new, things are different, like it's a whole new world.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily a good one. There's a lot kind of remaining from the old world that isn't good.
Mm-hmm. And we're seeing the death of not only a spouse here, but several family members. So I can see how it would be a melancholy existence. And the thing is, it keeps... Virginia's death is just... I'd say we talked a little bit about it on air. Virginia's death, you can largely draw a through line from Virginia's death to Poe's death. Marie Shue made a promise to Virginia to help tend to Edgar after her death, and she kept that promise. She even contributed financially considerably to Virginia's funeral.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she was a very sweet woman. And after an elegy published and much concerning behavior, a visitor to the cottage believed Poe, too, was dying of consumption. Shue and Maria Clem, his aunt / mother-in-law, saw him through the dark days after the funeral, but found his condition alarming. In February, he completely collapsed, and for a while it was thought that he might die.
Oh, wow.
He remarkably recovers, but Shue was convinced that something was attacking Poe's brain and nervous system, keeping a diary of her observations, saying, quote, "I decided that in his best health he had a lesion of one side of the brain, and as he could not bear stimulants or tonics without producing insanity, I did not feel much hope he could be raised up from brain fever," end quote.
Well, this kind of goes back to he was bleeding out of his ear.
Yes.
Years previously, and that just seemed to go away.
Yeah, when he very first arrived at New York, his ear was bleeding. And we talked in part 1 about how tuberculosis causes lesions that are largely internal and can be benign for many years.
Yeah.
So Shu might not be wrong.
Yeah, well, she's also a nurse, and so she knows more than the average.
She's not only a nurse, she's also a doctor's daughter. So she's like a second generation healthcare professional.
Mm-hmm.
So she's probably seen some stuff. And she has clearly tried some things because she's saying he couldn't bear certain things. So
She's saying she couldn't bear stimulants and tonics. I think she's referring to how he's acting while drinking. I think stimulants and tonics is specifically alcohol in her quote.
Yeah. She might mean that. That could be what she means. Because if we recall, Poe gets drunk very quickly, and one of those reasons could be this lesion on his brain, which would lead to the alcohol becoming more potent.
I think she's pointing that out in this because she says stimulants or toxins without producing insanity. I think she's realizing like he gets very drunk, crazy. Belligerently drunk quickly is how I'm taking that.
Yeah, she's sort of realizing that, and we'll see that in the next paragraph. Shu would also help Poe to inspire another of his famous works, The Bells. It would not see print until a month after his death. Unfortunately, alarm bells were also ringing for Shu about her friendship with Poe. The previous month, he had fallen to drinking. After dining with none other than Rufus Griswold, who was secretly hiding his disdain for Poe.
Uh-oh.
Yes, y'all, if you didn't catch part 1, Rufus Griswold is a bitter Poe critic who will write a tremendously offensive obituary of him. And he is on the town drinking with Poe right now, pretending that ain't nothing's wrong. And that would make perfect sense as to what Sam was saying, that seeing him take tonics is leading to insanity. She may have seen him, out drinking with Griswold. In this case, on this evening, Edgar is smart, and he's sent to Shu's home for help. So she arrives with her friend Hopkins, a man, because she probably needs help carrying him, and they find him intoxicated and being detained by the police.
Uh-oh.
Also at this time, Poe had again been missing for 3 days.
So he's out on binges, likely.
Yes, so he's binging. So she hadn't heard from him until he says, I'm drunk at the bar, come pick me up.
Yeah, like come to this address.
Yeah, she hasn't heard from him. And it seems what happened was he told Maria that he was going to the city to seek payment for an article, but once he received the money, he'd started drinking.
Well, that it kind of just fits a pattern of a general alcoholic, like just kind of that pattern that is very familiarized of you have the funds for it, you just go, or you have a minor reason to celebrate, you get a drink, anything like that. Like it's so easy to give yourself an incentive like that.
Yeah, just like what we talked about before, it's so cyclical. It's just this is happening again. And he gets this money, and so he's on a binge for 3 days, just like he said, just a binge. And it was this, and there were some other factors. She had a very religious husband who did not like any of this. And it finally did drive a wedge between Poe and Shu, and they would no longer speak.
Yeah, it sounds like he's just really... he only really reaches out to people when he really needs something, it sounds like.
Yeah.
And that makes it hard to be a friend.
Yes. It's a unique talent of Edgar's. That's another little thing that I clipped from here. But he had a very unique talent of writing a letter, or I may have said it in part 1, that starts the kind of insults and condemnations and then ends with asking for money. So yeah. And so we talked about this a little bit in part 1, the daguerreotypes. Daguerreotypes. Both of them. So, it's the morning of November 9th, and Poe was to be sat for a daguerreotype. And when it's taken, the angst and the years would be reflected in this image. And this is one of the 2 that we're extremely familiar with. It would become known as the Ultima Thule daguerreotype from a passage in one of his poems. And indeed, he does look haunted and doomed in this image.
Yeah, he does.
I don't want to, I don't want to feed into this mischaracterization of him like this, but in this image, he does. He does. And there's an earlier one called the Daily daguerreotype that was probably taken in the summer of 1847, a few months after Virginia's death, where he looks healthier. They said that he was still doing a little okay. However, in between that and this daguerreotype, there's a dramatic physical decline present in the photos. And of course, we'll post both.
Yeah, and heavy alcohol use absolutely will do that to you.
Oh, tear you up. It'll rip you up. So Poe had a trip to take him away from home approaching. On June 29th, he left Maria with 2 directives to follow in the event of his death. The first was that Rufus Griswold act as his literary executor and supervise the publication of his works.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I think we can see why he may have been taking him out to get drunk.
Mm-hmm.
The second directive he left was that New York editor Nathaniel P. Willis be charged with writing about his life and character. So this, and then off he travels.
Right.
And now here, we've finally reached the time where we're going to talk about Poe's final moments and a final character into this story who has some of his own fiction to write. So, tons of accounts you may have read feature Poe calling out for someone named Reynolds on Saturday evening, October 6th, 1849. Enter John Joseph Moran, the doctor attending Edgar Poe at his death. And get ready to hear some doozies. Also, remember that it is October 6th, 1849. Okay. So, Moran is the first one to have mentioned Poe calling out for Reynolds in a letter to Maria Clem dated November 15th, 1849.
So over a month later.
Over a month. She didn't know.
So
that was it. She didn't know.
What's the reference to him calling out to someone named Reynolds?
Oh, don't worry. We'll talk about that. It's so stupid.
So what was Maria notified previously of his death, and then this follow-up letter is a month and a half later?
No, this is her finding out. She doesn't. She had no idea he died. Yeah, she had no idea he died. And then he sends her this letter saying, oh, he was calling out for somebody named Reynolds and this, that, and the other thing. But like I said, get ready to hear some doozies. Because he just wrote her a letter a month and a half after the guy has died. And we're about to hear some stuff that you couldn't even tell the man's next of kin the correct information.
Uh-oh.
But, so in this letter to Maria, he claimed Poe was in a state of delirium while doing this all night. This being calling for Reynolds. He said, quote, having become enfeebled from exertion, he became quiet and seemed to rest for a short time. Then gently moving his head, he said, Lord, help my poor soul, and expired. End quote.
Okay.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Few believe Moran would invent details so soon after Poe's death, but neither could anyone place a Reynolds in Poe's life. That is until 1987, when Poe scholar William T. Bandy pushed back on this assumption that this Reynolds person ever existed in what he called the Poe-Reynolds myth. Bandy pointed out that Moran's first account, just saying, first account of Poe's death, there are multiple. In the first account, he has Poe shouting for Reynolds until 3 o'clock Sunday morning. And it's not something a doctor would easily or likely forget, Bandy noted. However, in the official memoranda published in 1875, Moran does not say one word about Poe's nocturnal shouts. Moran also, in 1875, his 1875 account, because this is the second. So we have one he's written upon his death, and now in 1875 we've written the official memoranda. And in the official memoranda, he had also moved the time of death to midnight, which some are saying is perhaps for drama's sake.
This might be a long shot, but do you think Poe would have created this story and had Moran like kind of recite it and then he lost track of what he was supposed to say? Because I feel like that's something Poe would do.
I think Poe would have made way better last words.
That's true. But maybe it's like he told him and then he didn't want to read off a piece of paper. And like...
It's true. Yeah, he didn't have like a clipboard. For me, it's the Lord help my poor soul, because throughout his entire life, Poe was known not to be a spiritual person and to actively not participate in church.
Right.
So...
that's probably just coming out of Moran's mouth.
Yes. So, and we've also noticed here that he's willing to change the time of death. Because now, in 1885, there's a third account. And Moran left the name Reynolds completely out of the record. At all. And omitted any delirious shouting. At all.
Weird.
Yeah.
So it's only in that first account.
Yeah, only in his first account is he saying...
Weird.
That stuff. Yeah. And so... he makes Poe more talkative in this version. And he went so far as to change the final words of Poe for a second time. He presented that Poe declared, quote, "Doctor, it's all over." He answered, "Mr. Poe, I must tell you that you are near your end. Have you any wish or word for friends?" Quote, "Nevermore, O God, is there no ransom for the deathless spirit?" End quote. Give me a break.
Yeah, that seems too, yeah.
That's... Come on. He did not say that. He did not. He did not. He did not say nevermore in his last sentence.
No.
He literally... There's literally part of the book where, he would make fun of visitors when they came to his house. He had a painting of a Victorian woman, and people would get fixated on it and, look at it, and he'd be like, "That's not the Lost Lenore." And he said that people would get fixated on, the top of his door, and he'd be like, "There's no raven up there." Those were all exact, he said that, all that happened. So there's no way. This dude's a liar. Just another liar. And the 1885 account, so before it's midnight, in 1875 it's midnight. The 1885 account, we don't even have anything. There's no official time of death. He just didn't even write. So for a third time, we're unsure of what time Poe died. The biographical consensus seems to have settled on 5 o'clock in the morning. And that is when his brother Nielsen as well said that it happened.
Okay, so that's probably closer.
Yes. The only certainty, though, is that by the time Nielsen Poe received the news early Sunday morning that Edgar Poe had ended his time on Earth, he was just 40 years old. And Moran had cited inflammation of the brain as cause of death.
So yeah, because I remember there wasn't like there's a cause, but they didn't know why specifically, because there could have been a handful of different things.
No, and we'll talk about the handful too. Briefly, because there aren't just a handful of things that could be. There's so many, but we'll talk about a handful of things that it could have been. Moran cited inflammation of the brain. But because Moran also goes on to give an elaborate and false description of Poe's funeral as well, with the book calling it, quote, close to complete fiction, end quote. Yeah.
Did people know at this point that Poe was rewriting his own history? Or was that something that became known later?
Oh, that wasn't known till later.
Okay, because I was going to say, is he just kind of like doing the same thing Poe did and was like inspired by him? But if he didn't know at the time.
No, people didn't find out Poe was embellishing so hard until later. But the sad truth about the funeral was it was a pitiful procession attended by just a handful of people, quoted. The journey to the cemetery took place on a cold and overcast Monday, October 8th, not the 9th, as Moran stated in his elaborate description of this alleged funeral. Eventually, in 1875, Poe's body was exhumed and moved to a more honorable location with a better marker. Recovering from a stroke even, Walt Whitman loyally made the trip to the dedication to the new monument for Poe.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. And it would also become the resting place for Maria and Virginia. So it's become kind of a family tomb, yes. Yeah, and the original place now of his burial has an image of a raven on it.
Oh, okay. That makes some sense. I'm not sure if he necessarily would have wanted that, but...
Yeah, but at least it's not like his main marker.
Yeah, and was clearly proud of the raven.
Yes, clearly proud, yeah. And the family tomb, like the raven isn't featured there, just in the spot his body originally was.
Oh, okay.
But yeah, that I should have made that clear. Yeah, the family tomb is like a monument to him and a sort of mausoleum for Virginia and Maria as well. And then before he was exhumed, that first place has the image of the raven.
I feel like he would have preferred it that way with what we know about him versus
I agree.
Like his whole family tomb being about him.
Yep, or about the raven. Because as much as he liked the raven, I don't think that he would have wanted his family tomb to be all about the raven. But
exactly.
What is another nice thing? A Methodist Episcopal ceremony was conducted by the Reverend William T.D. Clem, who was Virginia's cousin. So family was there. Mm-hmm. However, however, it lasted only 3 minutes, with Poe buried at 4 p.m.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and like we talked about, as it stood, Maria, most importantly, did not yet even know Poe was dead.
Oh, that's because she was notified November.
Yeah, she wasn't notified till November. Yeah.
So his brother, who got there, didn't notify her either?
I'm sorry, sorry?
You said his brother arrived, didn't you say 5 a.m? Something like that?
Nielsen, his cousin,
or was told.
just was told it was
cousin.
5 a.m.
So he didn't communicate with Maria at all?
No. No. And I do not, it did not say in the book what time he found out it was 5 a.m. What they said first was what I said first in the script, which was biographical consensus has placed it around 5 a.m. So, yeah. So, as it stands, Maria has no idea that he's even dead. And the day after the funeral, ridiculously, we've talked about it a couple times now, but here it's about to happen. Poe suffered what some called a second death when Griswold's infamous obituary appeared, published under a pseudonym.
So he's not even willing to publish it under his own name.
No, he's not scared. So it's under a pseudonym. It described Poe as, quote, unamiable, envious, arrogant, irascible, and cynical, end quote. And the thing is, the pseudonym thing doesn't work.
Good.
Because it was considered so brutal an obituary that many rushed to his defense, led by the French admirer Baudelaire. Because Poe had grown larger. I don't know how much larger than in America. I can't quantify that, but larger in popularity in Europe. So Baudelaire was he was a big celebrator of Poe. And he was not about to let the obituary stand. And then also, Griswold played himself in 2 ways. And the obituary backfired and didn't blacken Poe's reputation.
So his name got... I was going to guess what they were, but no, go ahead.
Yeah, no. The first mistakes he made were the obvious falsehoods. But that created the character that made so many interested in Poe for generations going forward.
So he's really the one to kind of set off that image of him.
Yeah, he's the one who makes this characterization, this larger-than-life personality of Poe that will last for generations.
Yeah, that people enjoy. It's not someone that people dislike as his goal.
Yeah. His goal, it said in the book, was that nobody read Poe. And second, everyone found out about the extent of his falsehoods, and he was cast as a villain driven by jealousy, resentment, and blind hatred.
And that's what you get.
Exactly. All right, folks, we're nearing the end, and we're just going to chat real quick about that handful of stuff that could have happened here. And the theories of Poe's death are many and varied, with Baltimore Post scholar Jeff Jerome estimating 22 distinct ones, with new ones showing up every year. Our largest problem is the sketchy evidence, or lack thereof. And the leading suspects are hypoglycemia, rabies, diabetes, tuberculosis, alcoholism, encephalitis, and heart disease.
Yeah, I was going to say with
That's a big list.
Swollen brain, as Moran had diagnosed, there's a lot of different possibilities that could cause that. So,
yes,
even if that was accurate, then there's a whole slew of things. But based on what else we know about Moran, who knows if that was accurate?
Exactly. So that's what I was going to say. My next thing I have to say here is just that's a long list, because Poe's symptoms during the last 3 months of his life can fit a lot of different things. He experienced hallucinations, fever, delirium, stupor, and agitation. And again, those fit a ton of things, and plus many other possibility theories that are related to internal diseases unknown at the time. Like some have proposed epilepsy, some have proposed, many different internal things that they couldn't have evaluated then.
And I'm assuming because you said he died on the 6th and his funeral was the 8th, they probably didn't do an autopsy.
No, ma'am, but I will talk to you with a quote from an autopsy author who has an opinion. So there was no autopsy done, and this actually isn't in there, so we should talk about it more, too. Because there was no autopsy done, and I'm quoting here from an author on autopsies named Hansma. And they said even if an autopsy had been done on Poe at that time, it would not have been a reliable autopsy, as it would have been probably done by Moran, and Hansma made no mistake in saying they would doubt to trust anything in that autopsy if Moran had anything to do with. And if Moran didn't do it, the autopsies back then just weren't like we have now,
Well, yeah, they still didn't know about so many different diseases and illnesses.
Most of what they said about the inability to perform an autopsy and that sort of thing was that the technology was in such infancy that even had one been performed, it likely wouldn't have yielded usable information.
Yeah, it would have been the bare minimum, but it potentially could be more than what we currently have.
Yeah, it could be, because we have to live in a lot of maybes. Because there are some people who even say maybe he was murdered because there was a practice called polling at the time where you would convince somebody to vote in an election for you and then steal their vote, essentially, by murdering them. And Poe's body was found in front of a voting center. So that's how wide the theories are.
Correct me if I'm wrong on this, because I could be thinking of somebody else, but wasn't he found in, the bank of a river?
You're thinking of somebody else. He was found in, a gutter. It was, or the gutter, essentially.
Okay. I'm trying to think of who I would be thinking of then.
Yeah, so that's how widespread the theories are. Some people think he may even have been a victim of this very common thing that did happen, but the only evidence connecting that is that he was in front of a voting center.
So,
there's no
with
real evidence.
With Moran being his doctor in those last few months of his life, he just was seeing him because he was sick. I was kind of assuming that he was almost bedridden in at least the last couple days with the way that he was talking about him yelling out in the middle of the night.
Yeah, no, you're right. I don't think Moran was his doctor for a long time. I think he was just the attending doctor when Poe was dying.
But then Poe left and died in a gutter. Because I remember hearing that he was found outside and there was people didn't know exactly what happened.
Yeah, it could have been that he was found in the gutter and he was brought to Moran. I originally left the polling murder thing out because I was taking up a lot of time, and that's a whole nother can of worms. But it is a theory. And so perhaps, because he was found in front of a voting center in a gutter, I do know that. So perhaps they found him alive and brought him to Moran. And that's how it
That would make sense. Yeah, because I'm pretty sure I remember hearing him specifically being found outside, and I'm thinking maybe it was a river, but I think gutter. I think I am thinking of the right person.
About the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're thinking about the same thing. Yeah. Gutter, river is kind of.
But I don't remember if he was found dead or alive because I think Morbid talked about it very briefly in one of their episodes, and that's when I learned about it.
Yeah, I don't know if we know, and if we do, it was not in the book I read, whether he was dead or alive. All we know is that Moran was attending him the night he died, but that does also bring into question. I mean, we already know that Moran is just a gigantic liar. But it just brings into even more question, like, how much did you lie about? Like, did he even get there alive? Like,
yeah, right.
We don't know. Yeah. And so, which is a great segue into Poe Scholar Savoy saying, quote, "Unless you dig up that body and find a hatchet sticking out the back, I'm not sure what additional information can be found. It's endlessly fascinating because it cannot be solved. There's no definitive explanation, and there won't be unless there's some startling revelation. We really just don't have the evidence." End quote.
Yeah, because at this point, like, even if you were to, like, dig him up and exhume his body, you would have to test bones, but most of these diseases wouldn't reflect in your bones.
No, yeah. And the most known and likely cause, which Hansma, the author on Autopsies, and myself both presume, is tuberculosis.
I think in all likelihood that tuberculosis or alcoholism before tuberculosis could kill him, but it was pretty close to happening.
I think that's a combination of both, because it's what happened to his father and his brother. So And Hansma says, quote, "No question in my mind that tuberculosis is at the top of the short list of strongest possibilities. It is unquestionably prime suspect number one," end quote. And I agree, because we talked about it in the first episode, but it's all highly contagious. It's the 1800s. It's fatal because it is not curable yet, and Poe, when he was just a little child, had already been exposed to tuberculosis several times.
Well, just throughout his whole life, just starting when he was a kid, but up with Virginia, he was exposed to it.
Yeah. Yep. With almost everybody in his life, he was exposed to tuberculosis. So that's where my brain lands. And Poe Scholar Kennedy summed it up well, saying, quote, "Poe really anticipated the feel of our own time, even more than Twain did. Poe is alive in our culture today and to readers today in ways that he wasn't alive to readers in his lifetime. Poe was so far ahead of his time in terms of intuiting changes that were already happening in the culture, and a lot of it has to do with the atrocities of the 20th century. We are now properly in a place where Poe resonates. A reader of the 2020s instantly understands the Mask of the Red Death and gets the sense of entrapment and fatality and the claustrophobic effect that Poe creates. That's where the quarantine put us, and we have people bidding defiance to contagion." End quote.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, because he wrote in a way that wasn't stuck to his time period.
Exactly. And the glow of the fireside poets failed to warm a world coping with the cold realities of a new century. And their light faded as we became less sure of comforting messages and more intrigued by Edgar Poe's troubling questions. And that's all in the saga of the great American poet, Edgar Poe. Sam, any final thoughts?
He lived a very interesting life, and it very different than what I would have thought, not knowing much about him. But it's fascinating, and I had
it is.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And when I had lunch with my grandma last weekend, my grandma is 97 years old. She was born in 1926, and she was telling me a lot about her grandmother at lunch. Aww. And this is around the 1900s, she said. So right at like the turn of the century. she was saying that her grandmother was a huge Edgar Allan Poe fan. And that was like something that was very important to her. She made sure to read anything and everything she could get her hands on for Edgar Allan Poe. And so I just found that really interesting I just happened to mention we're covering him right now on the show. And my grandma got very excited because that's one of her memories of her grandmother. So that was really a fun conversation.
That is so cool. And it just goes to show like how generational he is.
Yeah, and she said that my grandma and my grandfather went out to Baltimore at one point and visited his home there. Yes, it is.
It's preserved, I believe, in a museum.
Yeah, and my grandpa, he was a pretty big guy. He was very tall. And there's apparently this tiny staircase in it, and he could barely make it through. And my grandma was just laughing, remembering them visiting there, and like picturing my grandpa try to fit through this tiny stairwell in the house. And so it was a really fun conversation to kind of bring back those memories for her and hear things I've never heard about with our family.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, it was a good time.
Good. We had a good time come out of the Edgar Allan Poe story.
Right? There was a lot of sadness, but at least I was able to have a really fun conversation with my grandma.
Yes, there's a lot of sadness, but thank you for the literature, Edgar.
Yes. Well, thank you all for listening to Have You Heard About This Case? If you liked this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. You can follow our podcast on Spotify, or you can find us on Instagram at Have You Heard About This Case Pod, on TikTok at HYHATC, or you can email us at haveyouheardaboutthiscase@gmail.com. Thanks, and we'll talk to you later.